Imagine a land caught between collapsing empires, where the fate of millions hangs in the balance. After the First World War, Ukraine became more than a battlefield, it became a stage for history itself. The Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires had crumbled, leaving a power vacuum in its cities and countryside. Ukrainian nationalists, Bolsheviks, White Russians, and Polish forces all vied for control, each with a vision for the future. Ordinary people were swept up in extraordinary events. As families, farmers, and soldiers found themselves on the front lines of history, often struggling just to survive. But this was not just a story of armies and borders. It was the story of a nation awakening. Ukrainian intellectuals, poets, and historians were quietly laying the groundwork for a cultural revival. Language, tradition, and a sense of shared identity became tools of resistance and hope. Even as bullets and politics threatened to tear the country apart, the stakes were immense. Control of fertile land, industrial cities, and vital trade routes could determine the survival of entire communities. In the midst of chaos, daring leaders and ordinary citizens made impossible choices. Alliances shifted overnight, battles raged in towns and villages, and the dream of Ukrainian self-determination faced relentless challenges. From the ashes of old empires, a new chapter of Ukrainian history was being written, sometimes in triumph, often in tragedy. If you want to uncover the story behind how Ukraine navigated this storm of revolution, war, and ambition, stay with us, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because in this video, we will explore the rise, struggles, and resilience of a nation fighting for its place in the world. This is a story of courage, conflict, and the quest for identity. You won't want to miss a moment. In the 19th century, Ukraine found itself caught between two very different worlds, each shaping its culture and identity in strikingly opposite ways. On the western side, under the relatively tolerant rule of Austria-Hungary, Ukrainian language and traditions were allowed a cautious but meaningful presence in public life. Schools taught in Ukrainian, newspapers circulated, and intellectual circles flourished. In these spaces, a quiet revolution was underway, not with guns or barricades, but with pens, books, and ideas. It was here that the seeds of a modern Ukrainian identity began to take root, nurtured by the dedication of poets, historians, and thinkers who refused to let their culture be silenced. Figures like Taras Shevchenko, whose poetry spoke directly to the soul of the Ukrainian people, became symbols of a nation striving to define itself. Ivan Franko, with his sharp insight into social and political realities, provided a blueprint for intellectual engagement with the world. And Mikhailo Hrushevsky meticulously traced the contours of a Ukrainian history that stretched back to the medieval Kievan Rus, challenging the Russian narrative that claimed sole inheritance of that legacy. Meanwhile, east of the Carpathians, the Russian Empire pursued a very different path. Ukrainian language, literature, and expression were systematically suppressed. Deemed a threat to imperial unity, the 1876 ukaz forbade the publication and import of works in Ukrainian, banning public performances and attempts to promote the language. While Russian authorities dismissed Ukrainian culture as a minor variant of Little Russian identity, in villages and towns, peasants often remained illiterate, largely disconnected from the political ideas that were sparking change in the urban centers of Austria-Hungary. Yet even under these constraints, the flame of Ukrainian consciousness was not extinguished. Secret schools, underground publications, and the quiet efforts of devoted teachers and activists ensured that the language survived, even if its public expression was curtailed. This stark contrast between repression and relative freedom created a complex cultural landscape. Ukrainians who grew up in the Austrian sphere often returned to the Russian-controlled lands with ideas of self-determination and national pride, sharing knowledge that challenged the imperial narrative. Across the region, cultural revival became intertwined with the political awakening that would define the coming decades. Poetry, history, and scholarship were no longer mere pursuits of art or intellect. They were acts of defiance, laying the groundwork for a people who wanted to govern their own destiny. The intellectual efforts of Shevchenko, Franco, and Hrushevsky went far beyond literature and historical study. They provided a framework for imagining a Ukraine that could exist independently, with its own institutions, education system, and cultural life. Their work reminded Ukrainians that identity was not determined solely by the language spoken at the market or the customs of a village, but by a shared understanding of history, struggle, and potential. Even as empires fought over borders and soldiers marched across fields, these ideas traveled quietly through communities, whispered in classrooms, printed in newspapers, and carried in letters from one town to the next. By the early 20th century, the stage was set for a more visible, more determined movement, one that would take these intellectual foundations and transform them into political action, setting the course for Ukraine's tumultuous journey through revolution, war, and the eventual quest for self-determination. The story of Ukrainian cultural resilience in the 19th century is therefore not only a tale of survival under oppression, but also a testament to the power of ideas, scholarship, and artistic expression to shape the destiny of a nation, even when the physical and political circumstances seem overwhelmingly hostile. As the First World War engulfed Europe, the lands of Ukraine became an unexpected crucible where the hopes of a nation collided with the harsh realities of global conflict. Galicia, with its rolling plains and vibrant towns, became a front line not only for the ambitions of empires but also for the awakening of Ukrainian national consciousness. For generations, the people of this region had endured the constraints of imperial rule, their language and culture suppressed in the east and cautiously nurtured in the west. Yet it was the devastation of war that brought these simmering identities into sharp focus. Ukrainians found themselves conscripted into armies that did not reflect their aspirations, fighting on both sides, some under the banner of Austria-Hungary, others under Russia, while facing suspicion from officers who feared that their loyalties might lie elsewhere. Every march, every battle, and every skirmish was imbued with uncertainty, as soldiers struggled not only against external enemies, but also against the shadow of doubt cast by those who questioned their allegiance. Amid the smoke of battlefields and the clatter of artillery, communities endured hardships that intensified their longing for self-determination. Villages were stripped of able-bodied men, farms were abandoned, and families faced shortages of food and shelter. The war brought starvation, displacement, and disease, but it also fostered a profound awareness among Ukrainians that their fate could not be left entirely to foreign powers. Stories circulated of soldiers who, despite orders from distant generals, sought to protect their villages or aid neighbors caught in the chaos. Small acts that became symbols of a deeper connection to the land and its people. These acts of resilience and subtle defiance were a thread that wove together disparate communities into a collective consciousness, laying the groundwork for a broader nationalist movement that would later seek formal recognition and autonomy. In cities and towns, the war exposed fractures in society that mirrored the larger struggle for identity. Ethnic Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, and Jews lived side by side. Yet the pressures of war and the competition for scarce resources heightened tensions and fostered mistrust. Imperial authorities, already wary of nationalist movements, responded with suspicion and repression. In Austrian-controlled Galicia, Ukrainians suspected of sympathizing with Russia faced internment or even execution. While in Russian-held territories, the use of the Ukrainian language and the promotion of cultural institutions were strictly limited, as authorities feared that an educated and self-aware population might challenge imperial control. These measures, intended to suppress nationalist sentiment, often had the opposite effect, crystallizing the sense among Ukrainians that their identity, their language, and their future were at stake. Through letters, clandestine publications, and whispered conversations in the markets and town squares, the idea of a Ukrainian nation persisted and even flourished under adversity. Cultural figures, educators, and local leaders became quiet beacons of hope, reminding people that survival alone was not enough, that the preservation of language, traditions, and collective memory was essential. The war, with all its suffering, thus became a catalyst, accelerating the growth of Ukrainian nationalism and linking the fight on the battlefield with the fight for cultural and political recognition. By the time the guns fell silent, the experiences of these years had forged a generation of Ukrainians who understood that true autonomy would require more than courage in combat. It would demand unity, resilience, and the unwavering determination to claim their place on the map of Europe. In the turbulent spring of 1917, as the old order of the Russian Empire crumbled under the pressures of war and internal dissent, a remarkable opportunity emerged for the people of Ukraine. The February Revolution toppled the centuries-old Tsarist regime, leaving a fragile and inexperienced Russian provisional government struggling to assert control. Amid this uncertainty, Ukrainian nationalists saw a chance to translate decades of cultural revival and quiet resistance into political action. And from the heart of Kyiv, the Central Rada was born. Led by figures such as Mikhailo Hrushevsky, this council sought to navigate a delicate path, asserting Ukrainian autonomy while remaining within the theoretical framework of a federal Russia. It was a vision of self-governance that balanced aspiration with pragmatism, aiming to create institutions that could administer education, law, and civil affairs in the Ukrainian language, and to give a voice to the millions who had long been marginalized under imperial rule. Yet the Rada's ambitious project was met with immediate challenges. In the bustling urban centers, where populations were more ethnically and politically diverse, support for Ukrainian nationalism was limited. Poles, Russians, and Jews in cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv were often skeptical of the nationalist agenda, wary of policies that might prioritize ethnic Ukrainians at the expense of the broader urban populace. At the same time, Bolsheviks, energized by the revolutionary fervor sweeping Petrograd, viewed the Rada with suspicion. They supported the idea of national self-determination only insofar as it aligned with the broader revolutionary struggle, and they were quick to label any deviation as bourgeois or counter-revolutionary. This ideological tension created a precarious political landscape in which the Central Rada had to assert authority without evoking outright confrontation with either the urban populations or the emerging Bolshevik factions. Despite these obstacles, the Rada moved decisively to implement its vision. It issued proclamations asserting the right of Ukrainians to govern their own lives, organize schools, and develop cultural institutions. It began to draft laws and establish administrative structures, emphasizing that self-rule did not mean severing ties with Russia entirely, but rather creating a federated system in which Ukraine could manage its internal affairs. The council drew upon the historical memory of Kievan Rus and the traditions of Ukrainian Cossack autonomy to legitimize its actions, framing the pursuit of self-determination as both a continuation of a long historical struggle and a necessary adaptation to the modern political world. However, the broader context of ongoing war and revolutionary upheaval meant that the Rada's authority was constantly under threat. Troops loyal to Russia or to Bolshevik ideals sometimes disregarded local governance, while competing factions within Ukraine, from anarchist militias to pro-Russian loyalists, complicated efforts to unify the population under a single administrative framework. The Rada's challenge was to translate the ideals of Ukrainian nationalism, which had grown in literary salons, intellectual circles, and clandestine schools, into tangible political power capable of withstanding external and internal pressures alike. Each decree, each assembly, each act of governance was a test of whether a newly awakened national consciousness could survive the chaos of revolution. In this precarious environment, the Central Rada represented both the hope and the fragility of Ukraine's aspirations. It was a moment when decades of cultural and intellectual work coalesced into political action, demonstrating that national identity could shape governance even in the midst of upheaval. Yet it also revealed the limits of such ambition, showing that without broad-based support and a stable context, even the most visionary movements faced profound uncertainty. The formation of the Rada was not just an administrative milestone. It was the embodiment of a people striving to define themselves, to claim the right to direct their own destiny, and to navigate a path through the storm of empires collapsing around them. By November 1917, the aspirations nurtured over decades of cultural revival and political maneuvering coalesced into the bold declaration of the Ukrainian people as republic. A fleeting yet significant assertion of national sovereignty amid the chaos of a collapsing empire. In Kyiv, the Central Rada boldly moved to assert its authority, issuing its own currency and raising a flag whose colors, though reversed from the modern blue and yellow, symbolized a collective yearning for self-determination. This act was more than symbolic. It was a tangible assertion that Ukraine sought to control its own economic and political destiny, to create institutions that reflected the culture, language, and historical consciousness of its people, and to assert a legitimacy distinct from both the Russian provisional government and the rising Bolshevik power. The streets of Kyiv and other Ukrainian towns were filled with the energy of possibility, as citizens debated the future, rallied behind leaders, and navigated the excitement and uncertainty of a nation proclaiming itself on the world stage. Yet the Ukrainian People's Republic faced immediate and formidable challenges. From the east, Bolshevik forces were quick to assert their own vision of revolutionary order, viewing Ukrainian independence as a potential threat to the unity of the socialist project. Lenin's government, still consolidating power after the October Revolution, sought to establish a socialist state that encompassed Ukraine, arguing that the unity of the proletariat transcended the ambitions of individual nations. This ideological imposition created tension, as the Rada's leadership attempted to balance the assertion of autonomy with the practical need to negotiate and, where possible, avoid direct confrontation with a neighbor that wielded far greater military strength. Within Ukraine itself, political divisions ran deep. Urban populations, composed of Poles, Russians, Jews, and Ukrainians with varying degrees of nationalist sentiment, often viewed the Rada with skepticism. These divisions made it difficult to secure broad-based support, leaving the government vulnerable to both internal dissent and external military pressures. Despite these obstacles, the Rada endeavored to implement its vision of governance. Laws were drafted to regulate education, land distribution, and local administration, emphasizing that self-rule did not equate to complete isolation from the broader Russian context, but rather a federated arrangement in which Ukrainians could manage their internal affairs. The leadership drew upon the historical legacy of Kievan Rus and Cossack autonomy to legitimize their authority, appealing to both cultural memory and pragmatic governance as they sought to stabilize the fledgling republic. Economic initiatives, such as the minting of currency, were designed to establish tangible sovereignty and encourage civic engagement. Yet logistical challenges, wartime shortages, and ongoing conflict hindered their effectiveness, highlighting the fragility of the Republic's position. Military pressures further complicated matters. Bolshevik forces, supported by local sympathizers and revolutionary contingents, began pressing into Ukrainian territories, testing the Rada's ability to defend the Republic's claims. At the same time, internal factions with differing visions for Ukraine's future, ranging from socialist reformers to more conservative nationalists, created friction within governance, making unified decision-making a constant struggle. Every day was a test of resilience, as the Republic navigated between asserting its ideals and surviving the harsh realities of civil war. Shifting allegiances, and the relentless advance of better organized armies. The declaration of the Ukrainian People's Republic in November 1917 thus stands as a poignant moment in history, a testament to the courage and ambition of a people striving to define themselves. Its short-lived sovereignty reflected both the possibilities and the limits of national aspiration in a period of unprecedented upheaval, illustrating that even in the midst of chaos, cultural identity and political vision could assert themselves, if only briefly, on the stage of history. This episode serves as a reminder that the path to self-determination is often perilous, requiring both vision and the ability to navigate a landscape of unpredictable alliances. Ideological conflicts, and the relentless pressures of history in motion. The fragile Ukrainian People's Republic, born out of revolutionary upheaval and the aspirations of generations, soon found itself caught in a maelstrom of external interventions and internal divisions that tested its very survival. As Bolshevik forces pressed from the east, the Central Powers, primarily Germany and Austro-Hungary, saw an opportunity to secure vital resources and strategic leverage in Eastern Europe, intervening decisively in Ukrainian affairs. Their arrival brought both relief and new complications. The Red Army was driven back, allowing the Rada to regain temporary control over Kyiv. Yet the occupying powers had their own agendas, seeking to extract grain, secure loyalty, and establish a political order favorable to their interests. The delicate autonomy the Rada had struggled to assert was immediately undermined by the imposition of foreign priorities, illustrating the precariousness of national sovereignty in a region torn by war and competing ambitions. In this volatile context, the Hetmanate emerged under Pavlo Skoropadsky, a leader whose aristocratic background and close ties to the occupying Central Powers made him a pragmatic choice for those seeking order and compliance. Skoropadsky's administration promoted the Ukrainian language and attempted to implement governance structures. Yet it simultaneously rolled back many of the progressive reforms the Rada had championed, particularly land redistribution, and requisitioned peasant grain to supply the German war effort. This duality, support for cultural identity but suppression of economic autonomy, created tensions across the countryside, where peasant communities, long accustomed to both local self-determination and the burdens of imperial rule, found themselves resisting both old and new forms of authority. Armed groups, ranging from organized anarchist militias to spontaneous peasant uprisings, challenged the Hetmanate at every turn, asserting their own vision of freedom and local control, and making it clear that external endorsement alone could not secure stable governance in Ukraine. Simultaneously, the broader geopolitical landscape continued to exert pressure on the fledgling Ukrainian state. Poland, newly re-established in the wake of the First World War, pursued its own claims over ethnically and linguistically mixed territories, most notably East Galicia, leading to armed conflict with the West Ukrainian People's Republic. The Directory, a nationalist-led administration formed to replace the Hetmanate after Germany's defeat in November 1918, faced the monumental task of uniting a fractured country while simultaneously confronting both internal dissent and the lingering ambitions of neighboring powers. Peasant support was crucial, yet difficult to consolidate. Many communities remained wary of top-down authority. Whether Bolshevik, Hetmanist, or Directory-led, and the complex patchwork of allegiances often shifted with the tides of local conflict. Throughout this period, The struggle for Ukrainian authority was not merely a contest of military might but also a test of political legitimacy and popular consent. Leaders had to navigate a terrain where ideological, cultural, and economic aspirations intersected with the strategic calculations of foreign powers. Even as armies marched and flags were raised, the underlying challenge was to persuade the people that their government represented their interests, a task made exponentially more difficult by famine, displacement, and the pervasive violence that accompanied both civil strife and foreign occupation. Iconic figures like Nestor Makhno and his Black Army symbolized the potency of grassroots resistance, challenging any attempt to impose centralized control while advocating for a form of communal self-rule that resonated with local traditions of autonomy. The interventions of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Poland, combined with the persistent agency of local resistance movements, underscored the impossibility of a straightforward path to Ukrainian stability. The Hetmanate and later the Directory were forced to contend not only with external military pressures, but also with the enduring insistence of peasants, anarchists, and other groups that the future of Ukraine could not be dictated from the top down. Each negotiation, each confrontation, and each compromise reflected a delicate balancing act between national ambition, local loyalties, and the geopolitical interests of stronger powers. In this crucible of war, diplomacy, and rebellion, Ukraine's struggle for authority became a vivid testament to the resilience of a people determined to assert their identity and sovereignty, even when surrounded by forces far larger than themselves and caught in the relentless turbulence of a continent in flux. By the close of 1918, Ukraine had transformed from a fledgling experiment in national self-determination into one of the central battlegrounds of the Russian Civil War, a theater where ideology, ambition, and desperation collided with devastating consequences for the population. The once proud cities and fertile countryside, which had briefly glimpsed the promise of autonomous governance under the Rada and later the Directory, became arenas of repeated occupation, where control shifted constantly between Bolshevik forces, White Russian armies, Polish troops, and a patchwork of local militias. Each change of authority brought its own burdens, as occupying armies enforced conscription, requisitioned food and resources, and implemented policies that often disregarded local needs and traditions. Peasants who had fought for the Rada's reforms or resisted foreign-backed regimes found themselves caught in a relentless cycle of expectation, punishment, and upheaval, their lives reshaped by events far beyond their control. The Red Army's offensives, beginning in earnest in late 1918 and intensifying through 1919 and 1920, imposed a vision of centralized socialist control that clashed with long-standing Ukrainian notions of land, property, and governance. Land collectivization, one of the core policies of the Bolsheviks, aimed to reorganize rural production under communal principles. But for many Ukrainian peasants, it was perceived not as liberation but as coercion, an intrusion into the hard-won autonomy of their farms. Farmers were compelled to surrender grain and livestock to the state, often leaving families to endure hunger and hardship, fueling resentment toward the very forces that claimed to represent the working class. The promises of revolutionary equality and empowerment were undermined by the practical realities of enforcement, as soldiers and commissars exercised authority with little tolerance for local dissent, turning previously sympathetic communities into reluctant opponents. Violence extended beyond economic coercion. Pogroms against Jewish populations surged during this chaotic period, reflecting both deep-seated antisemitism and the way vulnerable minorities were scapegoated amid social and military turmoil. White Russian forces, Ukrainian nationalist militias, and even segments of the Red Army carried out attacks, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands and leaving communities fractured and traumatized. Towns and villages that had once been centers of culture and trade became sites of fear and mourning, as the ebb and flow of armed factions brought unpredictable destruction, highlighting the human cost of the broader geopolitical and ideological struggles engulfing the region. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and other key urban centers changed hands multiple times, each occupation erasing the fragile progress made by previous administrations and creating a sense of impermanence and uncertainty that permeated daily life. The Directory, which attempted to restore Ukrainian sovereignty, struggled to maintain order as local allegiances shifted in response to the pressures of survival, ideology, and immediate necessity. Meanwhile, the Red Army's push to integrate Ukraine fully into the emerging Soviet state demonstrated the limits of self-determination when confronted with a disciplined, ideologically motivated military machine. Even those peasants and workers who had initially supported Bolshevik ideals often found themselves alienated by the realities of administration, requisition, and mandatory military service, leaving them torn between ideological alignment and pragmatic survival. Amid these upheavals, the suffering of the Ukrainian people was both immediate and enduring. The combination repeated military campaigns, forced collectivization, and targeted violence left a profound imprint on communities, depopulating some regions, disrupting agriculture, and generating waves of displacement that would last for years. Ukrainian culture, language, and identity persisted, yet the cost of these struggles was staggering, underscoring the fragility of autonomy in the face of powerful external forces and the brutal dynamics of civil war. The period stands as a stark illustration of how the aspirations of a people can be repeatedly challenged, reshaped, and suppressed by the interplay of military might, ideological ambition, and the complexities of regional politics, leaving a legacy of resilience shadowed by the human toll of relentless conflict. By 1922, after years of relentless conflict, shifting allegiances, and unimaginable human suffering, Ukraine was formally incorporated as one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union. Alongside Russia, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation, what had once been a series of bold, aspirational experiments in self-rule, the Central Rada, the Ukrainian People's Republic, the Hetmanate, and the Directory was now subsumed under a political system that prioritized centralized control and ideological conformity over national autonomy. The dreams of independence that had fueled poets, intellectuals, and ordinary peasants for decades were deferred, and the structures of Ukrainian self-determination were dismantled. In practical terms, the right to secede or exercise real political agency was meaningless. Ukraine's fate was now inextricably tied to the broader Soviet project, with its promises of equality and socialism often overshadowed by repression, bureaucracy, and the dominance of Moscow. The human cost of this transition was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1 million people perished during the wars, famines, and political purges that accompanied Ukraine's incorporation into the USA. Families were uprooted, communities destroyed, and entire regions depopulated, leaving scars that would endure for generations. The national movement, which had demonstrated remarkable resilience amid foreign invasions and civil war, was forcibly suppressed, with Ukrainian language, culture, and historical scholarship strictly regulated and often censored. For decades, the memory of those early struggles, the sacrifices made by soldiers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens alike was overshadowed by the pressures of survival under a regime that demanded loyalty to the state above all else. Yet despite these setbacks, the essence of Ukrainian identity endured quietly in the hearts and minds of the people, preserved through language, tradition, and the unbroken continuity of communal life. waiting for the day when the opportunity for genuine self-determination would return. It was not until 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine would finally reclaim the independence so violently contested in the early 20th century. The yellow and blue flag, banned for more than 70 years, was raised once again, a symbol of resilience, continuity, and the enduring aspiration for national self-determination. The history of Ukraine's struggle during these decades serves as a powerful reminder of both the fragility and the strength of human societies, showing how people can endure tremendous suffering, adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, and still maintain a sense of collective identity, even under the most oppressive conditions. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most tumultuous and consequential chapters in Ukrainian history. If you found this story insightful, compelling, and thought-provoking, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history, where we explore the events, people, and movements that shape the world we live in today. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important stories to life, helping us understand the struggles and triumphs that define human history.